kid in a small town. I did my best just to fit in. Broke my heart on the playground. When they said I was different. Oh, now I'm all grown up and nothing has changed. Yeah, it's still the same. It's a hard life on easy street. Just white painted picket fence as far as you can see. If you think we live in the land of the free, you should try to be black like me. My daddy worked day and night for an old house and a used car, just to live that good life. It shouldn't be twice as hard. Oh, now I'm all grown up and nothing has changed. Yeah, it's still the same. It's a hard life on easy street. Just white painted picket fence as far as you can see. If you think we live in the land of the free, you should try to be all black like me. Oh, I know I'm not the only one who, who feels like I don't belong. It's a hard life on easy street, just white paint picket fences far as you can see. And if you think we live in the land of the free, you should try to be all black like me. Oh, and someday we'll all be free, and I'm proud to be all black like me, and I'm proud to be black like me. I'm proud to be black like me. Black like me.
The following program was produced by the United States Courts.
As the story goes, in December of 1955, a 42-year-old seamstress named Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to move from the white section of a bus because her feet hurt, launching the famed Montgomery bus boycott. In reality, she was neither in the white section, nor was she too tired to stand. She was simply tired of giving in. And the story doesn't start there, but Rosa Parks' actions brought the crisis to a head, turning the nation's eyes to Montgomery and the issue over to the federal courts.
The mid-50s, the state of affairs in Montgomery was substantially the same as it was throughout the South. There were laws on the books that provided for separation of the races in almost every public situation. And that's all any African American in Montgomery knew anything about. But I realized that it didn't have to be that way.
And that change began on a downtown Montgomery bus the afternoon of March 2nd, 1955, when 15-year-old Claudette Colvin was arrested on her way home from school for refusing to give up her seat to a white passenger.
She had been taught that she had a constitutional right. She was not sitting in the section reserved for white people. She had paid her fare just like the white people had paid theirs. We tried her case. He found her to be a delinquent. We appealed that case to the circuit court, and ultimately the case was dismissed.
Rosa Parks was very involved in the Montgomery Improvement Association, the NAACP, and other organizations to advance the rights of African Americans. She was neither quiet nor reserved.
If we were going to solve these problems, she also knew it was going to take lawsuits in order to do it. She didn't know whether she would ever be asked to get up to give up her seat. But if the opportunity presented itself, I felt that she would refuse to give up her seat.
On December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks boarded a bus here in downtown Montgomery and sat in the colored section. When the white section filled up and she was asked to move, Rosa Parks did just as Claudette Colvin did. She refused and was arrested. The news of her arrest spread quickly, and a few days later, the African American community rallied to commence the Montgomery bus boycott.
The decision was made that we was going to file a lawsuit. So we was claiming federal constitutional rights, and for those rights to be held, it had to be filed in federal court.
The question was how to make a case that you could bring in federal court, and that's what he did with Browder versus Gale.
I had our leaders checking with people to see who had had problems on the buses and letting me know who would be willing to be plaintiffs.
In the months leading up to Rosa Parks' protest, 4 other women were arrested for the same offense. Ordinary people, a widow with 6 children, a secretary, a schoolgirl, and a teenage churchgoer. On behalf of them and others, attorney Fred Gray filed Browder versus Gale, a federal class action lawsuit against Mayor Gale and the city of Montgomery to end segregation on the city's buses.
When Judge Johnson got this case, the chief judge of the circuit would then appoint 2 other judges to the case. And Judge Reeves was appointed, and Judge Lynn was appointed.
That case was decided in a 2-to-1 vote with Judge Reeves and Judge Johnson declaring the ordinances and state statutes to be unconstitutional.
Judge Johnson had been raised in a segregated culture. Judge Reeves had been raised in a segregated culture, and not just a segregated culture, but this very culture in Montgomery. And yet, they both rendered this decision, which was essentially counter to the very culture in which they had been raised.
On November 13, 1956, that decision was upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court and set precedent for numerous civil rights cases that followed. As a result, the African American community in Montgomery ended the year-long bus boycott.
The decision was based on a provision in the United States Constitution, in particular in the 14th Amendment, that says that persons cannot be denied the equal protection of the law. This means that all of us are entitled to equal protection regardless of our race or our religion or some other impermissible factor.
Little did we know when we started it that what happened in Montgomery has helped to change the landscape of this country, and at least it gives hope and courage to people to say, if the 40,000 African Americans in Montgomery, Alabama could stay off of the buses 382 days, then whatever problems we have, if we work together and make plans together, we may be able to solve those problems too.
I think the Founding Fathers wanted to develop a judiciary that was independent, that's why we were appointed for life, and that could render decisions that were not influenced by either the President or Congress. And it's that independence that allowed the judiciary, in particular the federal judiciary, to carry out the Constitution here in the South.
If we are to get to where we need to be, it's going to have to be federal judges who will be able to decide these cases and not be afraid of what someone may say or what may happen.
Decades after Rosa Parks stood up for her rights as a person of color, she remains an example of how all citizens can assert their rights by turning to the courts, the guardians of the Constitution.
Greensboro IV were yours truly, Joe McNeil, David Richmond, Junior Blair, and Frank McCain. We all lived in the same dormitory. I think we were all very young. I was the youngest, I was 17. I reacted to the Jim Crow South with anger. I did not believe for 1 minute that I was a second-class citizen, that I was inferior in any way to whites, greens, whatever. I couldn't live the lie. We decided to take a stand. Let's go. Let's do it. So we purchased small items, sundry items, to establish the fact that we were customers. And then we sat down on this stool and asked for a cup of coffee. And the store manager told us that he wasn't going to serve us. The local establishment grossly underestimated our anger and the ability to hang in there. So when we were leaving the store, the Associated Press was there. And they said, "Hey, boys, what you gonna do?" We said, "Well, we're gonna come back, and we're gonna keep coming back until you decide to serve us." We started growing. First day 4, the second day, probably 16 or 20. It was organic. It's a mind of its own, it kept growing. We decided that whatever actions we were going to take, they were going to be nonviolent. We remained nonviolent. On the third day, it started to get rough. At any time, we could have been carried out of that store in a pine box. We didn't want to be martyrs, but we had to do what we needed to do.
I was a student at Fisk University in Nashville. February 1st, 1960, we heard that 4 young black men sat in at a lunch counter in Greensboro. We had our first sit-in in Nashville on February 13th. I'm really amused sometimes because people say, "Oh, you were so brave." And the truth is, I was afraid the whole time. But the choice was to do what was necessary to end segregation or to tolerate segregation. And that just was not acceptable.
Greensboro became the message. It was like, if they can do it in Greensboro, we too can do it. And there were young people and people not so young, adults, in major cities outside of the South, participating, sitting in at lunch counters. They were picketing the stores to support the students in the South. And you had people like Martin Luther King Jr. saying things like, by sitting down, we were standing up for the very best in American tradition.
And I think that's really important for people to know that it was ordinary people, quote unquote ordinary, like themselves, who did everything for the civil rights movement, that it was really a people's movement.
These young people injected something very meaningful, something really beautiful. I said, you may not have a lot of money, you may not have a lot of power, but you have what Dr. King and Gandhi and others call soul power. Just using your body as a nonviolent instrument, as a tool, you can change things. You can inspire hundreds and thousands and millions of people to speak up, to speak out.
I walked away with an attitude that if our country is screwed up, don't give up. Unscrew it. Don't give up. Which in retrospect is pretty good for a bunch of teenagers.
Welcome to a Capitol Moment. My name is Douglas Ike, and I am standing in front of the statue of Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass is the first African American to have a full statue on display here in the Capitol building. Although he began life as a slave, Frederick Douglass became a respected author, a powerful orator, and an advisor to presidents. He was one of the first African Americans to gain international fame for his intellect and leadership abilities. Born in 1818 to an enslaved mother and an unidentified white father in Talbot County, Maryland, he was first named Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. In the first 2 decades of his life, he was given lent or hired out to various masters, but he also learned to read and write. Reading books and newspapers gave him a new perspective on slavery that was doubtlessly reinforced by his time with an especially brutal slave breaker. He dedicated himself to becoming a free man, and in 1838, he managed to escape to New York. During the Civil War, Douglass was a recruiter for the 1st African American Army Regiment, which 2 of his sons joined. He met twice with President Lincoln, first about the pay and treatment of black soldiers, and then to discuss the president's desire to assist escaping slaves. What inspires me most about Frederick Douglass is his courage and willingness to fight for what he believed in. His persistence in working to end slavery will always be remembered. For more information about the artwork of the Capitol or to book a tour, go to visitthecapitol.gov.